Because some shows always have like a nice like 30-second intro, but they want $500 a year to be able to put an intro on, so I ain't paying that.
Yeah. Oh, wait, hold on one second.
Yep.
Okay. All right.
All right. So this is Milky Biscuits Radio with your host Cove, and I have my special guest here, Larry. If you can give everybody a quick intro of who you are.
Hi, I'm Larry Schechter, and I just released a new book called The History of Fantasy Sports and the Stories of the People Who Made It Happen. And I wrote a book 10 years ago, 2014, called Winning Fantasy Baseball. I'm known to be one of the better fantasy baseball players. I'm in the two fantasy baseball experts league. One's called Tout Wars. One's called Labor, sponsored by USA Today.
Mhm. Now, do you do like very extensive fantasy baseball, like every stat kind of thing?
No, I do
No.
standard. Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, because some people I know will go like every stat possible. It's like in a league, I'm like, there's too many in baseball to follow.
yeah, yeah. Well, one thing in my book, my book covers the whole history of how everything developed, and one of the reasons for the standard stats in baseball is because when people first started playing fantasy baseball, that's what was available in the newspaper.
Oh,
It's like
okay.
you couldn't get random, unusual stats or in the box score. It's pre-internet. You just had to look at the box score in the paper.
Mhm.
And one interesting story is there was a league with the office staff at the USA Today Sports Department, and they wanted to have, I think it was caught stealing. I could be wrong, but I think it was caught stealing. They wanted to use as a statistic, and you couldn't get that in the newspaper or the box score back then. But
Mhm.
because this was the sports department, they decided to add it. So they had the ability to add it to the box score just because they wanted to use it for their own personal league.
Mhm. So we have 10 questions asked Larry here. So I'll go with the first one here. What inspired you to research and write about the history of fantasy sports?
Well, I've played for a little over 30 years. And, when I first started, you got reports in the mail, or other leagues, the commissioner would do it by hand and, distribute it to the league mates. And most people had never heard of fantasy. And what's happened over the years, it's grown into this ridiculously huge industry where you have millions and millions of people playing all over the world, everything from fantasy football, fantasy baseball to fantasy cricket. I did a ride wakeboarding. I mean, you got fantasy everything. And you got
Mhm.
news services, stat services, injury experts, Sirius XM radio 24/7, fantasy channel. I mean, this whole thing has become humongous. So I've wondered for a long time, like, how did this all happen? How did we go from ideas people had years ago for games to where we are now? And nobody has ever written anything like this. There's never been history written about how this all happened. There've been, you can get little pieces of how certain things happened, but there's never been any kind of comprehensive history. So I decided, if somebody should do this, I might as well be the one to do it.
Mhm. So can you share any interesting stories you've uncovered during your interviews with industry insiders?
Yeah. See, what happened is when I first got the idea and started, I was going to write, the book was going to be called The History of Fantasy Sports.
Hmm.
And I was going to tell, like, who did what when, how it all happened. When I started doing research, I interviewed dozens and dozens of people. I did massive amounts of research. It took 18 months. And when I started to research and talk to people, I was seeing all these really interesting stories of what people did. So I realized early on I could just write the history of fantasy sports, tell us, who did what, when, et cetera, and it would get the job done, but it would also come off as a very boring research paper. But instead of doing that, I'm telling the stories of what people did. So I'm incorporating their stories with the who did what when, et cetera. So instead of being like a boring research paper, it's really interesting. People say it's fascinating, it's easy to read, things like this. So, give you a couple examples. I mean, there's like a whole lot of stories, but, for example, um, one of the first statistic services, when computers came around, people who were early computer people realized, like, hey, we can use a computer to do fantasy statistics rather than people having to do them by hand and take 10 hours a week.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the first statistic services was run by a couple named Jim and Gloria Berger from Pennsylvania. And what they had to do for baseball then was get the USA Today. On Tuesday, they published the American League statistics. On Wednesday, they published the National League statistics. And Gloria would read them, and Jim would enter them into the computer, calculate all the results, print it out. Wednesday night, they got the reports in the mail to their clients. One Wednesday, Gloria went into labor with their first child. And they didn't let a little thing like going into labor stop them from getting their job done. So in between contractions, Gloria would read the statistics to Jim. And then she'd be like, wait a minute, hold on, here's another one coming. Okay, it's gone. And then she'd continue reading the statistics. And they got the report in the mail that night on time, and their daughter was born. And today, 37 years later, their daughter, who was born that day, plays in a fantasy football league with her dad.
Okay. So, how has the fantasy sports industry evolved over the years, and what trends do you see shaping its future?
Well, my book starts actually before modern fantasy sports. When I say modern fantasy sports, I'm referring to fantasy sports that are based on events that haven't occurred yet. So you're using real professional basketball players or football players or whatever, and you're drafting teams before the events have occurred. Whereas before fantasy, there were games such as APA and Stratomatic that were based on real professional players, but using their statistics for prior years, what they'd already done. Um, so it evolved from precursors to fantasy like APA and Stratomatic to where the people would have to do statistics by hand, get the box scores out of the papers, and then computers made it real easy for people to get the statistics and to make the roster changes. And then the internet, everything blew up with the internet because it made it so easy for people to play. They could go online, make their own roster changes, see the standings and whatnot. Also, as technology kept improving, you went from having computers be able to calculate the results like once a day. Like, it used to be like when computers and the internet came out, you could have like football games on Sunday, and by Monday you'd see the standings. Then it went to where they could update the scoring every hour, and then you could update the scoring every minute or so. And then it was like live scoring. Something happens on the field, and instantly you could see it online if you want to.
Mm-hmm. What role do you think fantasy sports play in modern sports culture and fandom?
Fantasy sports makes people enjoy sports more
Mm-hmm.
for the most part. Um, Harsh Jain, who runs a cricket company, well, cricket is their primary thing in India, he said fantasy sports is like getting uh, fantasy sports is like getting popcorn at a movie. It just makes the movie better.
Yeah.
Sports is great. Playing fantasy sports makes it better. And the leagues, the professional leagues and the players associations were very resistant to fantasy in the early years. But over time, they started to figure out fantasy is actually good for them. It's like, who knows all the tight ends in the NFL? People who play fantasy. Who knows the backup shortstop for the Pittsburgh Pirates? People who play fantasy. Who's buying more of the TV packages? Who's buying, who's spending more time every week watching baseball games or football games? The people who play fantasy. So they find the leagues finally came around and realized fantasy is actually a good thing for them.
Hmm. Oh yeah, like I know people that didn't even know certain players, and then once they start playing fantasy, now they can name starting lineups because they're
Exactly.
so used to setting their lineups so often.
Right.
What challenges did you face in compiling such a detailed history of the industry?
Well, first of all, it was just a lot of work. I had no idea what I was getting into. I thought it was something I could knock out in 3 or 4 months, and it took like 18 months, as I said. And I was interviewing a lot of people about things that happened 20, 30, 40 years ago. And, most people can't even remember what they had for lunch yesterday, let alone something happened 40 years ago.
Yeah.
So a lot, there was a lot of stuff that was difficult to get to the truth of things. Um, and, sometimes people would say conflicting things and I'd have to figure out like what really happened. Um, yeah. So there's one chapter is about the Fantasy Sports Trade Association, how that all happened. And I was trying to find out who was at the first Fantasy Sports Trade Association board meeting, who was on their regional board. And some of the people was easy to figure out, but then like the last few was really difficult. Some people said there are 10 board members, some were saying there are 12 board members. Um, and I had like something like at some point I had like maybe 7 of them confirmed. I knew who 7 of them were, but I wasn't sure of the rest of them. And I had set up an interview with a guy named John Zaleski, who ran one of the early companies. And I knew he was one of the original board members. So I wanted to ask him if he could remember who else was on the original board. And I told him, okay, this is who I have confirmed. There's, these 7 people I know for sure were on the board. I'm not sure of the rest. And I read him the 7 names. And one of the names was Christina Schellhart from Sporting News.
Hmm.
And he said, oh, no, she wasn't there. There were no women on the first board. Um, and he just didn't remember because she absolutely was there. She was absolutely one of the first board members. So he just didn't remember from 30 years ago or whatever, that there was a woman there. One thing he did remember, though, which is in the book, is he remembers at the first board meeting, they were sitting at a big conference table. He was sitting at one end, and Barry Dorf from EA Sports was sitting at the other end. And before the meeting started, the two of them looked at each other and started laughing out loud. And somebody said, why are you guys laughing? And simultaneously, the two of them said, because we're at a fucking board meeting for fucking fantasy sports. It's like they couldn't believe fantasy sports had evolved to the point where they would be at a trade association and have a board meeting.
Hmm. Uh, so, are there any lesser known facts or tidbits about fantasy sports that you found particularly intriguing?
Yeah, well, one stat that many people know is it's estimated right now that about 50 million adults in the U.S. play fantasy sports, and that's
Hmm.
just adults, doesn't even include under 18, and there's a lot of under 18 who play. So that's known by a lot of people, but something that most people don't know, and I didn't know, which blew my mind, is 200 million people play fantasy cricket in India.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, 200 million. Four
Jeez.
times as many play fantasy sports in the US play fantasy cricket in India.
Hmm.
And then the big cricket company, the guy I just referred to, it's worth $8 billion.
Damn.
Yeah, and another thing that I didn't know, like I didn't know 99% of the stuff that's in my book. And most people, even people who've been in the industry their whole life or played fantasy their whole life, don't even know most of what's in the book, or didn't know most of what's in the book until they read it.
Yeah.
Um, but like one other thing is there are a couple of guys in Canada who in Canada, going back to the 70s, they had something called a hockey pool that was very popular in Canada, where you'd have 3, 4, 5 guys, maybe 10 guys at the most, and you'd each pick a few hockey players, and you get a point every time they get an assist or a goal. You get a point, and that's like like a season-long hockey game.
Hmm.
And people in Canada liked it; they played it, but they were drafting players, and there's only so many hockey players. That's why you can only have maybe 10 people at the most in a hockey pool. But
Mhm.
their two guys figured out a way to make it to make a game where you could have an unlimited number of people play. They had a format where they they put 20 20 sets of like four players. So they
Mhm.
would take like four players of approximately equal caliber and 20 sets of these four players, like 80 players total. And you would have to pick one player from each of the 20 lines.
Mhm.
So that way you could have an unlimited number of people play, and the chances of somebody having picking the same exact 20 players is like, 1 in 1 million or more. And they got a newspaper to sponsor the game, and it was really successful. And then they got more newspapers to sponsor it, and they brought fantasy hockey to the masses in Canada. And at their height, they had 1 million people playing at one time.
Oh yeah, I was doing it out of the newspaper because I'm Canadian myself, and
Right,
that's how I started fantasy sports. Was in the newspaper, picking
right,
one person in a box, like you said, box four. You pick so many players,
exactly. That's
you
it. Yeah,
send in so much money, and then at the end of the year, you'd win it if you got the most points or whatever.
right. And that whole story, how they did that's in the book. They and they were like so close to failing, and they gave it one more try, and that's when they became successful.
Mhm. Yeah, because it was about 98 or 99 when I actually started doing fantasy online. I think it was CBS. It was the first one I ever did.
Yeah, yeah, they were one of the first, or maybe the first, I forget, that had it online.
Hmm. And that was just me, my brother, and all of our friends basically would do it,
Right.
kind of thing. So, how do you think fantasy sports have impacted the way fans engage with sports today?
Well, like I said before, it just people play fantasy are more engaged. They watch more baseball or football or whatever sport they're playing,
Hmm.
and they'll watch games that they wouldn't have watched ordinarily. Like if you're, I've always been a Red Sox fan, so before
Hmm.
fantasy, I would watch Red Sox games, and maybe I might catch part of like a Yankee game if the Red Sox were competing with the Yankees, to be in first place or something like that. But I'm not going to watch like a Cleveland Chicago White Sox game,
Hmm.
especially if the two of them suck, that year. But
Yeah.
when you play fantasy, you're watching all kinds of games. Like, oh, I got a starting pitcher's pitching for the Pirates tonight, and I got three of my hitters are on the White Sox. And so you watch all kinds of games because you got players in all kinds of games. So it makes people more engaged. They watch more. They look at more box scores. To know all the players.
Oh yeah, no, I've seen that. In the last year of me doing like these podcasts or whatever, a lot of my guys do fantasy sports, and yeah, what are you doing tonight? And they're like, oh man, I gotta watch the Cleveland game because this I got a relief pitcher in, and he might play, and this might help me win tonight. So
Right.
I've noticed that a lot of people are really watching more sports because of
Yeah.
who's on their team.
Exactly, and also in blowouts too. Like if you got um, like a Monday night football game, the score could be 30-0, and most people are tuning out.
Hmm.
But if you got fantasy players going, you're watching till the very
Right,
end.
and yeah, just because you're trying to get that last second victory or whatever, last
Yeah.
second points. Uh, did you come across any surprising revelations or unexpected connections while researching for this book?
Um, well, I mentioned a couple of them.
Hmm.
Um, there um, there were some part of what I was doing was like detective work, trying to find out things that happened or what was like true or not. And I heard a story from a guy. A guy I interviewed ran one of the first statistics services, and he told me a story about one day there the this was when they had lives. This was when they had like scoring was up, could be updated pretty much every minute or less.
Hmm.
Um, and one day the stat feed it stopped in the middle of like football games. It just stopped working for like 45 minutes. And the reason is it turned out there were two players with the same name on each team. And that made the stat service go kablooey. It couldn't handle that.
Mm.
You had a guy on each team with the same name. So he told me this story, and he couldn't remember. The guy who told me the story, his name was Jim Serra, who ran this company. He told me the story. He couldn't remember the players, but he remembered the story. So then, like 2 months later or something, I'm interviewing this other guy, um, who he was. I think it might have been John Hanson. If you read my book, everything in the book, that you got all the details and facts. I don't remember every detail, but I think it might have been when John Hanson had like the first fantasy football radio show. I heard the story that they booked Adrian Peterson, who they thought this is a big get for their show. And within like the first 30 seconds of interviewing the guy, they realized they got the wrong Adrian Peterson. They didn't have the star Pro Bowl running back of the Vikings. They had the Adrian Peterson, who was a backup running back on the Bears.
Oh, jeez.
Okay. So I hear this story and a light bulb goes off in my head. And I email Jim Serra. I say, Jim, that story you told me about the two players, was that by any chance a Vikings Bears game with Adrian Peterson on each team? And he emails me back, yeah, that's it. So there were things like this too. Like there was a guy who ran a company, years and years ago, and I was trying to track him down and interview him, and I couldn't get any contact information. And then I'm interviewing this other guy about something else. And for some reason, the first guy's name came up that I couldn't track down. And the guy I'm talking to is like, oh, I know him. I was partners with him on something. So then I got his contact information.
Yeah. Yeah, I was joking with some of the guys I work with. Hunter Renfro, for example.
Yeah.
It's you got him in the MLB, but you also have him in the NFL. And it was like before, internet, if you look it up, you hear the name, and you're like, is that the first two-star athlete? But it's two different guys from two different leagues who their last names are spelled differently. But when you hear it, you're like, no, is that the same guy we're talking about?
Right.
Kind of thing. So I always remember Hunter Renfro because it's just because I was confused by like, does he play baseball and football? Because it's been done by Dion and Bo and stuff like that. So like I actually thought he was like a multi-star athlete. Then I actually
Right.
looked at the name and I'm like, oh, it's two different guys because two different last names. How it was
Right.
spelled. But it can be confusing if you have two players in the same name.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this was all new. I mean, computers were new, stat services were new, and they went through a lot of challenges with technology. The the guy who helped start ESPN Fantasy Sports, he told me some of the challenges they had with the technology of getting computers and running statistics and everything was just overwhelming. And he said, it requires as much work, the same effort to have like online the live statistics for say the Giants Cowboys football game. It takes the same amount of effort for like the Giants Cowboys football game as it does for your individual fantasy league.
Mm-hmm.
So if there are 20,000 fantasy leagues on ESPN, each individual 20,000 of the 20,000 leagues, they require as much effort as when they're showing the stats for the Giants Cowboys game and the Eagles Cardinals game or whatever. And especially back in the beginning, it was a real challenge.
Yeah. I mean, just aside for a second, is there one fantasy site that you think is better than another's fantasy site? Like as a whole?
There are a couple sites that I use and I like, but I'm not going to mention them because I haven't looked at every site. I'm aware of a lot of sites. I've glanced at some of them, but I have not, in depth looked at a bunch of sites. So I wouldn't want to even say like who I like because for all I know, there could be, there's probably 3 or 5 or 10 just as good or maybe even better. I don't know.
more or less, I'm saying, like, do you find that, like, somebody starting a fantasy site is better, or the leagues are better at doing fantasy, in your opinion? Like, NFL does one, but ESPN does one. Like, I'll just use that for example.
Right.
Like, do you think that
Um,
the leagues do better, or do individual sites do better with fantasy?
that I don't know either because
Okay.
again, I haven't examined all the sites. Um,
I mean, from your experience, though, what have
yeah.
you used more? Like,
Well,
sport, like,
I have not played fantasy using like ESPN or Yahoo, so I don't
mhm,
know. Like I've been in leagues where like they have their own stat service. Like I've been in the NFBC and NFFC where they use stats to do their statistics. And I've been in like labor and tout wars that labor uses. I think on um, one of them uses on Roto. It's called. So I've never been in a league on ESPN or Yahoo.
okay.
So I just couldn't tell you.
Okay. Did you? Okay. Oh, what do you hope readers will take away from your book, The History of Fantasy Sports?
Well, they'll take away a lot of great stories. A lot of them are funny. A lot of them are inspirational. Um, and they'll also take away one thing that just really kept it recurring throughout the book and became like a theme of the book, even though I wasn't trying to make it, is how fantasy brings people together. Fantasy sports are great and it brings people together. You got people who started fantasy leagues years ago, like in high school or college, and they're still playing 20, 30, 40 years later. Whereas they may have drifted apart. A lot of high school, college friends drift apart over the years, but it's kept them together. You got parents playing with children. You got coworkers playing that helps bond people in the office and make friendships. One company you might have like the sales department and an accounting department that ordinarily would not interact with each other, but because they have a fantasy league, they interact with each other.
Hmm.
You got you'll have a fantasy football draft in Las Vegas where you got a plumber at the draft table sitting next to the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and the two of them are talking like they're best buddies.
Hmm.
So it's like a cultural phenomenon that yes, it's fun, people love it, and it really does a lot to bring people together.
Now, for the last one, are there any personal insights or reflections you like to share about your own experiences with fantasy sports through the years?
Um, I would just reiterate what I just said. It's fun. I mean, there are times it's really aggravating. You go to a draft and the season starts, and 2 days later, your number one draft pick, you know, is out for the year or something. So there are times it's very aggravating, but overall, it's fun, and it's definitely good for relationship building. Like the when I go to drafts in person, like in Labor and Cat Wars, for example, I've been in there in those for years. So every March, I got a weekend with Labor and a weekend with Cat Wars, and I see a lot of the same people, with occasionally new people, and it's fun and a good experience.
All right. Well, it's been fun learning about your book, and I've had your book up here for the entire show, so people can find it on Amazon, the price and the synopsis of your book and everything. So hopefully everybody can get have a good read of it.
Yeah, it's available on most booksellers' websites, paperback and ebook. Amazon is easy to get it. Amazon's where you're going to see a lot of reviews, more details of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and anybody who plays fantasy sports will love it. And even like I said before, a lot of people who have never played fantasy sports have really liked it because of the stories. Because it's not about like the details of how to play fantasy sports or strategy. It's about the stories of the people.
Mm-hmm. And that's the basis of it. Like I said, like you were saying, me and my mom have been in a fantasy league for 10 years now. My mom doesn't really watch a lot of sports, but she's more engaged now because me, my brother, my cousins, the whole family does an actual one every
Right.
year.
Exactly.
So it brings us back. It brings us all together, and a lot of shit talking too. You know,
Exactly.
every
Exactly.
time
Yeah.
you win. So it's
Right.
always fun. I just never like listening to my mom because I never hear about it until the next year. She'd be like, if she beat me in week 13, she's like, she'll hold on to it until next year until I play her again.
Right.
So
Yep.
it's
Exactly.
always fun. So it's been fun talking to you this last half an hour. So hopefully, a lot of people that will look into this and
Yeah. Get
enjoy
like
it.
either buy it or get it on your holiday gift wish list. You got the holidays coming up in a few weeks.
Hmm.
Yeah. Or buy or if you know people that play fantasy sports, you want to get them a gift. It's a great gift to give. Also.
Oh yeah, I mean it's always good to research everything, no matter what you do. Especially with fantasy sports, if you want to read something that's gonna inspire you to do more, or maybe like I said, bring people together. Someone might go, "Hey, well, this is a great thing to start in the office, or start at work, or
Right.
whatnot." So it might be
Yeah.
a team building thing.
Yeah, and it's not like a strategy book. Like if you find like a good strategy book or
Mhm,
a website that you think is really good, giving really good advice, that's something you don't want to share with your league mates. You want to keep it to yourself, so
mhm.
you feel like you have an edge on your league mates. But something like this, you can give it to your league mates as a present.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, 100%. They
Yeah.
can read about it, understand it a little bit more, and take a little more pride in it. Because I find some people get really religious when it comes to fantasy sports.
Oh yeah.
It's like a second nature. It's like I can't do this until I set my lineup. I got to do this first. I got to do this first, and like I said about the shit talking, or some leagues I've been in have been very interactive, where each owner will put out a video every week talking about their upcoming week. So it's helped people to get a lot of social skills too,
Yeah.
like reading, writing, and all that stuff. Like it's helped a lot of people I've know develop a social skill or not be so afraid to talk to somebody about something.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So, so what do you got next on your plans? Do you have another show
Uh,
lined up?
God, what was that?
Do you have another show lined up? Because I know you did.
Oh,
Did, did
I've been doing a lot of them. I don't have anything more today,
yeah?
but yeah.
You just did one with JNFS for sports, didn't you not?
Yeah, I did that
Oh,
last night. Yeah.
oh, last night. Okay, yeah. I'm under his brand myself.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I've been with him for about 9 months now myself.
Good.
So I've never actually been on his show. He's never been on my show, so it's kind of funny that way. We've
Right.
always done our own thing.
Where in Canada are you?
I'm in Prince Edward Island,
Okay.
way east. Not so much. Yeah, I mean Newfoundland's more further than me, but pretty much I'm as far as east as you can go. You can go in Canada. It's a fun day. It's snowy over here.
Okay. All right. I'm in
So I pre-
Florida. I'm in Florida.
oh
Let me
yeah.
let me look. Wait, I'm gonna look out the window and check. No, it's not snowing. Not snowing
Yeah,
here.
yeah, not snowing. Yeah,
No.
I think it'd be pretty surprising if it started snowing down there.
Yes, it would be. That would not be a good sign. No. It'd be like,
Yeah, my best friend's in Florida himself, and he talks about how cold it is. I'm like, man, you don't know cold until you come to Canada.
oh yeah,
Like he said, 3 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm like, three? Like Jesus, we're minus. Well, I think where I'm at, we're minus 15 all year round, Celsius, which is usually about a low 10 or 20 or for you guys for Fahrenheit. But that's common for Canada to be always cold. We're only warm 2 months a year
yeah.
for our summer.
Oh,
So that's why we have a lot of our people go down to your state because it's
yeah.
a snow
I
births.
know. Yeah, they do. I know a lot. I know a lot of Canadians that have either moved here or they come here for the winter. Yeah,
Hmm. I mean, it's a great spot, great destination if you especially want warm and whatnot.
yeah. Oh yeah.
So, so I appreciate you taking your time to sit down and talk with me about your book.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We'll be back later tonight. Me and Vince have our show at 10 o'clock tonight. We're going to be talking about all the four majors. Uh, I think it's 9 o'clock Eastern is when we have our show tonight. So, thank you all, and I will see you guys later tonight.